You hear it everywhere, right? Birth rates are falling off a cliff. Our societies are getting older, and a global population collapse is just around the corner. But here's the question. Is this a real, unprecedented crisis that's going to bring down civilization? Or is it a moral panic, something we've actually seen a few times before? Let's break it all down, starting with the case for crisis. And look, the alarm bells aren't coming from just anywhere. When one of the most famous people on the planet says civilization itself is at risk, you tend to listen. This is the absolute core of the crisis narrative. We are standing on the edge of a demographic cliff. And this entire massive debate, it all boils down to one single, incredibly important number: 2.1. This is the magic number, the benchmark that basically decides if a population is growing or if it's shrinking. So what does it actually mean? Well, it's called the replacement rate. You see, the point 1 is there to account for kids who sadly don't survive to have their own children. So if a country's average is above 2.1, it grows, simple enough. But if it's below 2.1, it shrinks. And right now, more than half the world is already below that line. All right, so let's really unpack this case for crisis. It all starts with the literal shape of our societies and how that shape is changing fast. Historically, healthy, growing societies looked like a pyramid. You had this big, wide base of young people. Think of the baby boomers back in the 60s. They're the ones who would grow up to work, innovate, pay taxes, and support the smaller, older generations at the top. That structure, that's the engine of economic growth. Okay, now let's fast forward 60 years to today. That pyramid is starting to look more like a column or a rectangle. Decades of lower birth rates have shrunk that base, and that huge baby boomer generation, well, they're now that big bulge you see in the middle and at the top. The fundamental structure is completely different. And if you want to see what this looks like at its most extreme, you have to look at South Korea. Here, the pyramid is actually flipping upside down. The base of young kids is terrifyingly small, while the biggest chunk of the population is nearing retirement. That leaves a tiny, tiny workforce to support a massive elderly population. And you have to understand, this isn't just about abstract charts. It's about intense, real-world social pressure. We're talking about a hyper-competitive education system with grueling after-school cram schools, an absolutely brutal work culture, and housing costs that are just out of reach. It's gotten so bad that many young Koreans feel like they have no choice but to give up on dating, marriage, and kids entirely. And hey, this isn't just a South Korea problem, not at all. You see similar trends all across the developed world, each with its own local flavor. You've got Japan's decades of economic stagnation, you've got massive youth unemployment in Italy and Spain. The bottom line is, the conditions for starting a family are just getting harder and harder everywhere. So this brings us right to the heart of the crisis argument. It's what people call the demographic trap. When you have a shrinking group of workers trying to support a booming group of retirees, the strain on things like pensions and healthcare becomes, well, immense. Proponents of this view say the system, as it's currently built, just can't handle that kind of imbalance. But what if that whole apocalyptic view is just wrong? What if we're missing the point? Now let's explore the counter-argument that this isn't some new, terrifying crisis. It's a moral panic that we've actually seen before. So you really have to ask yourself, is this panic justified? Is it really about the numbers? Or is it maybe rooted in something else, like a fear of social change, a fear of a future that just looks different from the past? Because, and this is the wild part, we have absolutely been here before. Seriously. Back in the 1920s and 40s, the British government was in a full-blown panic, predicting grave economic consequences from low birth rates. Then, just 20 years later, the panic completely flipped 180 degrees to fears of overpopulation. And, of course, all those dire predictions turned out to be wrong. So really, it boils down to two completely different ways of seeing the world. One view sees imminent collapse. It sees the elderly as a burden and low birth rates as a threat. But the other view sees something else. It sees economies that can adapt. It sees positive social changes, like more education and opportunities for women. And it rejects the whole stereotype of older people as just being a drain on society. And that second view, the critical one, it's not some new idea. I mean, listen to this. All the way back in 1946, demographers like Frank Notstein were arguing that an aging population isn't a failure. It's a tremendous success. It is direct proof that we've gotten way better at public health, at medicine, at keeping people alive and healthy for longer. It's a sign of progress. This critical view also takes aim at a key statistic the alarmists love to use, the so-called dependency ratio. Now, this ratio sounds scary, but critics say it's deeply flawed. Why? Because it treats everyone over 65 as if they contribute nothing, as if they're an economic blank slate. It totally ignores huge contributions like volunteering, providing childcare for grandchildren, and all the money they spend as consumers. So, okay, if it's not a crisis of civilizational collapse, then what are we really talking about? This brings us to a third way of looking at all this, a way that suggests maybe we've been asking the wrong questions this whole time. What if the issue isn't that people have stopped wanting to have kids? In fact, when you look at surveys from all over the world, most people say they want more children than they actually end up having. So, the real crisis, then, might be about the huge economic and social barriers that are just standing in their way. And the data? Well, it backs this idea up completely. When you ask people, hey, what's stopping you from having the family size you actually want? The answers are overwhelmingly about money and security. Financial limits, job insecurity, and housing costs. Together, they make up nearly 80% of the reasons. So, it's not some big mystery. The problem is a set of 4 huge, very real barriers. People can't afford a home big enough for kids. They can't find or afford decent childcare. Their wages aren't keeping up. And on top of it all, a lot of young people are just deeply pessimistic about the kind of future they'd be bringing a child into. Which leaves us with one final, really important question. What if the goal shouldn't be to frantically chase some demographic target like 2.1? What if, instead, the real goal is to build a more affordable, more supportive, and more stable society? A society where having a family feels less like an impossible financial burden and more like a joyful, achievable possibility. What do you think?